Hey everyone, welcome back. In the wake of President Biden announcing that he is going to run for re-election in 2024, there's been a lot of discussion about polling numbers surrounding the current president, especially his job approval ratings. A lot of people have come out and said, well, his approval rating is in the mid to high 30s, it's way too low for him to win re-election, he shouldn't be running. And while his job approval rating is certainly part of his electability, it doesn't really tell the whole story. And when it comes to looking at any polling data, the most important thing to look at isn't the numbers, but the question that was asked in the first place. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's use President Biden's approval rating as an example. Generally speaking, whenever pollsters want to figure out a president's approval rating, they'll ask a question that sounds something like, do you approve of the job that the current president is doing? Yes, no, or uncertain. And based on the responses, you can kind of get a fair gauge of the nation's attitude towards the president. In this case, President Biden is not doing particularly well, again, hovering around that mid to high 30s depending on which poll you take. But that really doesn't tell us about his electability because that isn't the question that was asked. If you wanted to ask, would you vote for President Biden in the 2024 election if he was the Democratic nominee, you might get a slightly different set of numbers because within that group of people who disapprove of the job President Biden is doing, there are two main groups. Number one, you've got Republicans, who obviously aren't going to approve of President Biden because they disagree with him on basically all levels of policy. So that's unsurprising. But you're also going to find that there are a good number of progressives who disapprove of the job Biden is doing, not because they disagree with him on policy per se, but because they don't think he's going far enough. They think he should be going further in advancing the policies that they agree on, such as going into things like Medicare for All, pushing more parts of the Green New Deal, forgiving all student debt, etc. So, while these progressives and Republicans both agree that they don't like what President Biden is currently doing, they don't like what he's doing for very different reasons. And if you ask those progressives the second question, would you vote for President Biden if he was the 2024 nominee for the Democratic Party, they're probably not going to be thrilled about it, but they're also probably not going to end up voting for the Republican. So, the approval number doesn't really tell you how people are going to vote because that's not the question that was asked. We actually got a great example of that divergence between how people were assessing the polls and reality in the 2022 midterms. President Biden's approval rating at the time was about the same as it is now, and there were a lot of people predicting that there would be a big red wave that year, with the Republicans picking up somewhere between 50 and 60 seats in the House and taking control of the Senate. And based on historical data, that made a lot of sense. Presidents with approval ratings in the mid to high 30s did not do well in their midterm elections. But then, that red wave really never showed up. Republicans only ended up with a 5-seat majority in the House, and Democrats actually gained a seat in the Senate. So why did people make this mistake? And it's because they were looking at the wrong question. When people were being asked, do you approve of President Biden's performance? There were different ways people approached the question, but it didn't really seem to have that big of an impact on how they voted in House and Senate and other state-level races. At the end of the day, even Mitch McConnell admitted that in a lot of key races for the Senate Republicans, they just didn't have quality candidates that voters were willing to vote for. And so they voted for the Democratic Party. Take, for example, Georgia. A lot of people looked at Herschel Walker and said, yeah, we're not comfortable with that. We may not love what President Biden is doing right now for a variety of reasons, but it's definitely better for us to vote for Raphael Warnock than to put Herschel Walker in the Senate. And there, when you looked at the polling data that was more specific to the state, it was a lot closer to what ended up being the actual election results, and President Biden's approval rating really didn't have that much to do with it at the end of the day. And that's the mistake that I think a lot of people are making right now. They're looking at President Biden's approval rating over a year out from the election and saying, it's a little bit low, I don't like his chances. When we can't even start asking the right questions to figure out how Biden might do because we don't know enough information about the 2024 race. Specifically, who Joe Biden might be running against. If we take the data that's currently around for the Republican primary, we would get a 2020 rematch with President Biden versus former President Donald Trump. We know how that went in the past, and there's some data out there to suggest that it would go about the same way in 2024. There's also people conducting polls that put Biden against other Republicans like DeSantis, Nikki Haley, Tim Scott, and even the ever-present generic Republican, which is a wonderful figment of pollsters' imaginations. But none of these candidates are currently in a good position to actually become the Republican nominee and run against Biden, so it doesn't really matter how Biden might do against them because it's not very likely he's going to be running against them as of right now. There's a lot of time between now and November 2024, so we'll have to wait and see how things develop. And once we know a little more, we can start asking the right questions to start thinking about how President Biden might fare in his electoral prospects. So, whenever you're looking at any kind of polling data or survey-based research, don't just look at the numbers. Take a second to look at the questions that were asked, and consider whether those are the right questions in order to arrive at the conclusion that you're actually looking for. Think about it.